Ashes of Creation's combat is not in a great place right now. We are going to give Mr. Steven Sharif and the developers at Intrepid some actionable, constructive feedback. Combat is one of the most important and tactile systems in the game.
I've said this in the past, the design team knows this, we all know this. Combat is the most tactile system in the game. Combat needs to feel responsive. It needs to not feel floaty. It needs to feel mobile. It needs to be fluid. It needs to give a feeling of satisfaction.
We are going to break down combat into 4 categories and then compare and contrast these systems with WoW Classic and WoW Retail. Let's take the good from these games and throw out the bad. We also don't need to reinvent the wheel. So first we have mode. Second, we have spellbook and or abilities. Third, auto attacks. And fourth, ability resource. So first, mode. When I say mode, I'm talking about the system used for the player to engage in combat. AOC is embracing 2 of these systems, which are 1, action combat, and 2, tab target. Tab target is the most traditional system, where you select the enemy and then cast a spell or ability. There are no skill shots. You just have to be in range of the enemy and you must have line of sight. Tap target is more in line with the Dungeons & Dragons combat style where dice are rolled for attack and defense. Okay, 2, action combat. Action combat is more akin to first-person shooters where you either hit or miss the enemy based off of your aim and your skill, and the enemy's chance to dodge or block your attack is dependent on the enemy's ability to move its character or to juke the oncoming attack. Think of Call of Duty or Chivalry 2 or Spellbreak. Ashes of Creation is taking a hybrid approach. Players will be able to choose either 80-20 or 20-80, meaning they can choose what mix of action combat and tab target combat abilities they want. This will be done through talent allocation, secondary archetype augments, and even what religion they choose in game. Second, spellbook and or abilities. When it comes to the number of spells or abilities you can have, AOC is taking a hybrid approach. You can either go wide and shallow or narrow and deep. With your spells and abilities. When allocating your talent points, you can choose to invest in getting more spells or invest in those other areas like the passive skill tree or the weapon skill tree, or even investing those points into the few spells you do have to make those spells stronger. Third, auto attacks. In Ashes of Creation, auto attacks are actually not automatic. You must cast them with either Q or a mouse click. Auto attacks exist both in action combat mode and tab target mode. Fourth and finally, ability resource. Currently in Ashes, all abilities are mana based and have cooldowns. Ability resource in Ashes of Creation is pretty boring, but hopefully this is just a function of it being in alpha. Okay, what can AOC learn from the granddad of MMORPGs, Classic WoW? Again, first mode. WoW Classic was primarily tab target with a few action feeling spells like Blizzard, Hunter Traps, etc. Mostly AoE stuff. Second, abilities and spellbook. Each class has about 20 plus spells of various types, offensive and defensive cooldowns such as Innervate, Evasion, Ice Block, Adrenaline Rush, etc. A larger spellbook gives each class a niche and an identity. Third, auto attacks. WoW Classic's auto attacks were tab target only. The auto attack was determined by the weapon equipped and the swing timers that varied by weapon. Auto attacks were mostly irrelevant for mage and healers, however wands were used when you were out of mana. Auto attacks took a backstage to the main abilities, especially as you progress towards endgame. Fourth and finally, ability resource. WoW Classic had mana, which depletes when used and replenishes out of combat or without casting for 5 seconds. Energy, which depletes very quickly on use, also replenishes very quickly in and out of combat. Rogues, feral druids also had combo points that were built up over time on the enemy, then consumed with finisher attacks, and rage, which builds up during combat and depletes when used or out of combat. Classic WoW's strengths. Each class has strong class identity. Each class had its own unique spellbook and its own niche for combat and utility. Class mastery was high, and unique builds could be achieved through unique talent point allocation. Additionally, each healer felt unique. Paladins were great for healing the main tank, and priests were great raid healers. WoW Classic weaknesses. WoW Classic lacked rotation variety. Even though there are 20 plus spells bound to your action bar, sometimes only a few buttons were used. Okay, let's do a quick overview of Retail WoW, then get to our juicy, actionable, constructive feedback for AOC. Retail WoW combat got much more interesting. For example, you had your different rotation archetypes. You had your cooldown based rotations like Fire Mage. You also had your setup rotations where you had the Land of Frost Trap or you had Land of Sap, and of course you had your proc based rotations with Frost Mage's Flurry proc or the Combat Rogues Roll the Bones procs. WoW Retail's biggest success was its damage rotations and combat. Weaknesses. Okay, WoW Retail fails to balance anything. loss of class identity with borrowed powers that come and go with each expansion. We lost the rock, paper, scissors dynamic that existed in WoW Classic. Now for actionable, constructive feedback for Steven and the team at Intrepid. First, AOC needs to scale back its action combat system or rework it completely. Currently, it is not good. Auto attacks can remain either action or tab, however, give me a reason to use one or the other. For example, ranged abilities in action combat mode should not have range limitations. However, these attacks should never lock onto the target. Think of a first-person shooter or Spellbreak. You should be able to miss the target. This is also true for castable abilities. You should have the risk of missing your target, but you should also have the reward of hitting targets farther away. For action abilities and spells, action combat mode should make all abilities true action, again like Spellbreak, or if the coding is too intense, then just use tab where some spells have an action flavor, similar to how Retail WoW is primarily tab target with some action flavor spells. With just a tab target mode, you can still have directional skill shots like the laser beam that doesn't require a selected target. Currently, the action combat mode, where the camera is fixed and the reticle appears, feels pointless. The action combat mode feels awkward because you essentially tab target enemies by hovering the reticle over the enemy, which turns the reticle red, which then locks onto the enemy. What is the point? It feels weird, I don't like it, so change it please. If I go into action mode, I should be able to send my fireballs or other ranged abilities into the sky if I want, but if not and it's too hard to code, then borrow some combat ideas from Retail WoW. Intrepid seems to be hyper-focused on auto attacks. Why? Auto attacks should be filler damage, primarily used when your abilities are on cooldown or if you are out of mana or ability resource. Auto attacks should contribute to less than 20% of the overall damage per encounter, make the weapon swings much slower. This will make the attacks also have weight and impact. Currently, it feels like I'm swinging a foam sword. To drive the point even further, games where the auto attack is super important are games where you have only 3 to 4 abilities. Think of New World, think of League of Legends, think of Zelda Breath of the Wild. In those games, auto or basic attacks matter only because you have a few other spells or abilities. I don't think Intrepid should go down that path. Games with large spellbooks of 20 plus abilities play into that D&D archetype of strategy as opposed to button mashing. It's only early days as AOC is still an alpha, but we need better class identity. Don't make the mistake of giving everything to one class. Make tanks unique because they have the best damage mitigation and the best crowd control. I am already nervous that the mage has great mobility, great damage, and has crowd control abilities. Give each class strengths and weaknesses that can be exploited. Intrepid, give me interesting damage rotations and combinations that have some RNG aspects to the game. Make it so that my optimal damage rotation changes with each encounter due to the abilities proccing or unique enemy resistances. Make my fireball do less damage to fire dragons. Make me have to plan out my attacks beforehand, but also keep me on my toes while I'm in combat. Give me damaging abilities, offensive and defensive cooldowns, unique resource management, build up and release damage rotations, etc. Borrow some mechanics from Retail WoW while maintaining class identity. Overall summary: rethink action combat mode. Give me Spellbreak or give me Retail WoW combat. Don't try to be decent at everything. Make a stance on a combat system and perfect it. Make auto attacks feel heavier by slowing down the swing and the time between attacks. Give me spells and damage rotations that synergize and are interesting and make me use my brain. I am making these suggestions because I want Ashes to succeed. If you agree or disagree with my suggestions, then let me know in the comments below. I can be persuaded. Also, please like and subscribe. Peace.